Today we're checking out a CPU that I've been wanting to test for a long time, AMD's infamous FX-9370. Released back in 2013, this 8-core beast was AMD's attempt to push clock speeds as far as they could go. But of course there was a catch. It carried a massive 220 watt TDP, making it one of the hottest and most power-hungry consumer CPUs of its era. But back in 2013, that number was absolutely huge. So today I've paired this CPU with 32GB of DDR3 memory and an RX 580 8GB version. Does the FX-9370 still have anything left to offer, or is it simply a relic from another era? The first game is Arc Raiders, running at 1080p on low settings with motion blur turned off and AMD FSR set to balanced. Performance here is actually better than you might expect, with the game averaging 41 FPS, the 1% lows coming at 18 FPS while the 0.1% lows drop to 15 FPS. Now, to really understand the FX-9370, we have to rewind to 2013. PC gaming was different back then. Extra CPU cores didn't help like they do today. Most games used up to 4 cores, and many leaned heavily on 1 or 2 fast cores to do the bulk of the work. So, instead of core count, what really mattered was raw single core speed. That's why Intel ruled gaming back then. Chips like the i5-3570, i5-4670 and i7-3770K had strong per core performance. So, a fast quad-core was really all you needed. Then there was the FX-9370. On paper, its specs looked impressive, especially with its massive 4.7GB boost clock. But there was a catch. It came with an eye-watering 220 watt TDP. That was almost double the power draw of Intel's CPUs at the time. Next up is Company of Heroes 3, running at 1080p on the low preset with AMD FSR2 set to balanced. During today's testing, the processor was sitting around 50 to 60% usage, while the RX 580 was, well, pretty much maxed out. The experience isn't perfectly smooth, and you'll notice the occasional stutter during the larger battles. But overall it's surprisingly playable, and what really impressed me the most is how well the FX-9370 holds up. Despite its age, these 8 cores are still putting up a decent fight. And with FSR set to balance, the RX 580 gets just enough performance boost to keep things feeling reasonable. So, overall the game averaged 50 FPS, with a 1% low of 19 and a 0.1% low of 10 FPS. Next up is Cyberpunk 2077. Running at 1080p using the medium graphics settings with depth of field and motion blur turned off, and AMD FSR2 is set to balanced. The RX 580 may be a little bit ancient, but it still has plenty of life left in it, especially if you're putting together a budget gaming server. Thanks to its 8GB of VRAM and solid DirectX 12 support, if you're building a small gaming server, the RX 580 is still a practical choice. But of course it's not without its drawbacks. The RX 580 is built on AMD's older Polaris architecture. But even so, if you're looking to build an affordable gaming server, the 580 remains one of the best value graphics cards ever made. It may no longer be cutting edge, but it still delivers an excellent balance of performance, features and affordability. Performance-wise in Cyberpunk 2077, the system averages 49 FPS with a 1% low of 33 and a 0.1% low of 15 FPS. Next up is Far Cry 3, running at 1080p on high settings with 4x MSAA enabled. The thing is, a 220 watt CPU wasn't something you could just drop into any odd PC. You needed a fairly hefty, quality power supply with plenty of headroom to handle not only the processor, but also the graphics card and everything else once the system was under load. AMD recommended pairing it with a high-end 990FX motherboard, as a lot of the cheaper boards simply weren't built safely to deliver that kind of power. For this build I'm using the Asus Sabertooth 990FX Revision 2, which is more than up to the task. And of course all that power came with a lot of heat. If you wanted the FX-9370 to maintain its full clock speeds without throttling, you needed some serious cooling. So today I'm using the Noctura NH-D15, which is handling this CPU pretty well. As for Far Cry 3, the experience is actually pretty good overall. It's smooth and enjoyable for the most part, with performance averaging 60 FPS, the 1% lows at 20, while the 0.1% lows at 14 FPS. Next up we've got Fortnite, at 1080p resolution on the low graphics preset with motion blur disabled and TAA enabled. With these settings, the system averages 71 FPS with a 1% low of 34 and a 0.1% low of 14 FPS. For a game like Fortnite, the FX-9370 actually holds up better than I expected. Well, most of the time anyway. Gameplay feels smooth, and the average frame rate is high enough to keep the experience enjoyable. But what really surprised me the most though, was that the RX 580 ended up being the limiting factor here. While the FX-9370 still has a tiny bit of headroom left. And when I say tiny, I mean it's absolutely running on fumes, but it's still keeping up, and that's impressive considering how old this CPU is. Next up we've got Helldivers 2 running at 1080p, using the low preset with motion blur turned off and AMD FSR set to balanced. On average the game comes in at 29 FPS with a 1% low of 18 and a 0.1% low of 7 FPS. In terms of playability, it's definitely still playable, but you'll need to accept a few compromises. This is one of those games where you really start to notice the limits of the FX-9370. But with that said, one thing that really stands out is how much AMD FSR really helps. In this test we're using the balanced preset, and that gives the RX 580 a real boost. It's a great example of how upscaling can breathe new life into older graphics cards, making games that would normally be too demanding more playable. Yeah, sure, the lower the internal resolution means the image isn't quite as sharp, and it can take a little getting used to. But the extra performance that FSR provides makes a huge difference, helping keep this engine hardware surprisingly capable even in 2026. The final game is The Outer Worlds 2, running at 1080p on the low preset with AMD FSR 3 set to balanced. Performance was quite decent with the FX-9370 averaging around 42 FPS, while the 1% lows came in at 28 and the 0.1% lows were around 24 FPS. So, after putting the FX-9370 through its paces, it's safe to say this old AMD monster is a lot more interesting than I expected. Back when it launched, the FX-9370 was known for being a hot, power-hungry chip that pushed AMD's architecture to its absolute limits. It was never the most efficient processor by a long shot, and it struggled against Intel in many gaming situations due to its weaker single-core performance. But looking at it today, there's something impressive about how well it can still hold up. Paired with an RX 580, this system managed to deliver playable performance across a surprising range of games. Older titles like Far Cry 3 still run brilliantly, while even newer and more demanding games can even be enjoyed with the right settings. It's not going to compete with an RTX 5090, but that was never really the goal. It may be outdated, insufficient and far from perfect, but the FX-9370 is still capable of doing the one thing that matters the most: playing games. So if you enjoyed this look back at the AMD FX-9370, a true marvel of 2013, be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more retro PC content. I'm David James. Thank you for watching, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one.